Russia has rejoined a US-Turkish brokered deal on Ukrainian grain exports just days after suspending participation. Moscow had accused Ukraine of launching drone attacks on Russian shipping in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked his Turkish counterpart for his help in preserving the deal. All of this guarantees safe passage for the ships carrying grain export from Ukraine. Russia's president, meantime, says the country still reserves the right to pull out if Ukraine uses those corridors once again, this is the accusation, for military purposes. Here's the response from Zelensky.
You have probably heard today that the Kremlin is saying that they have demanded security guarantees from Ukraine. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider such statements. 252 days ago, Russia demanded security guarantees from the United States of America. After 8 months of the Russian so-called special operation, the Kremlin is demanding security guarantees from Ukraine. This is indeed a striking change. It shows both the failure of Russian aggression and how strong we are when we remain united.
Jill Doherty is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. As a former CNN correspondent and Moscow bureau chief, she covered Russia and the former Soviet Union for 3 decades. Good to see you again.
Hey, John.
So Vladimir Putin, he suspended Russian involvement in this humanitarian agreement on grain exports 4 days ago, and every day since, Turkey, the UN and Ukraine have been committed to the deal. They've stayed in it, trying to make it work with or without Russia. Is that something which maybe Putin didn't see coming, which is why this flashpoint was resolved in days instead of maybe weeks or months?
You know, I'd have to think that's the case, because if you look at this, it looks extremely clumsy diplomatically by Putin. I mean, as you said, they pull out of the deal. They say they were attacked by the Ukrainians. There's no confirmation of that. Nobody's taking responsibility. Details are murky. And then 4 days later, he backtracks. And the reason I think, you know, if you look at what did it gain Putin? Not a lot. He looked vindictive, certainly, and even vindictive when it comes to, you know, developing countries that really need that food. He also exacerbated the world food crisis, got a lot of criticism, a wave of criticism all over the world. And then, as you pointed out, the United Nations and Turkey continued to remove the grain and to ship it off. So that was, in effect, ignoring what Vladimir Putin had said. So I think it really ends up as a true diplomatic blunder.
And well, now Russia is back in, but there's often a catch, and so it is with this decision by Putin to resume participation in the grain export agreement. And here it is. Listen to this.
I have instructed the Defense Ministry to resume our participation in this work. However, Russia reserves the right to withdraw from these agreements if these guarantees are breached by Ukraine. In any case, even if Russia pulls out of this deal.
That was the case before this dispute. It remains the case today. So essentially, while it kind of sounds menacing or intimidating, does that threat to reserve the right to withdraw actually change or mean anything?
I don't think it does. I mean, they had been threatening weeks ago to pull out anyway. And so then they finally did it. And unfortunately, this agreement, it's a temporary agreement that expires November 19th. So I don't think it really does anything for Putin. And then I think it was important, though, that he said, even if we pull out of the deal again, we will continue to supply this food to these developing countries, ones that really need it, poor countries in Africa, the Middle East, South America. And I think what he's doing is he made a very big point that a lot of that grain was going to Europe. And he wants to put himself on the side of developing countries. So hence, I think it was important for Putin to say, but don't worry, even if we do this again, we'll take care of you.
Yeah, and with that in mind, Turkey's president, who's been one of the mediators here, he received a shout out from Putin for mediating this latest dispute. And in Parliament on Wednesday, there were big cheers for Tayyip Recep Erdogan, who announced that Russia was back in. And then he added this, to your point, what you just said. Listen to this.
As we agreed with Mr. Putin, we will run this corridor for the poor and underdeveloped countries in Africa, such as Somalia, Djibouti, and Sudan. He advised this to us, and we will do it.
And that's really quite significant because much of the grain which has been exported since this deal was struck, back in July, it's been sent to the wealthy countries, or mostly wealthy countries. So by Putin focusing on nations, poorer nations, to now get the food which they need, not only does it seem kind of oddly out of character, but it's also fairly smart global diplomacy.
Well, it is, but don't forget that Russia has been, let's say, lobbying and trying to improve its relationship with the developing world, especially Africa. I mean, I was in Moscow 2 years ago when, at the same time that we were there, they had a big conference with African countries coming to Russia, et cetera. So I think that's their diplomacy has been that way. They are, and this is the message that they want to put out. We are a friend of the developing world, not those rich, imperial countries of Europe. So it's all part of the messaging that Putin has.
Well, he's staying on message, if nothing else. Jill, thanks for being with us.
Sure.
Iranian-made Russian combat drones continue to inflict heavy damage on Ukraine's power grid. The latest strike in the Dnipro region has knocked out electricity and water supplies. The capital Kyiv came under a sustained attack on Monday. Millions were left in the dark without electricity and running water, and for the first time, the biggest hospital in the capital also went dark. CNN's Selma Abdelaziz has our report.
Dialysis patients like these need running water for their treatment. So when Russia targeted Kyiv's infrastructure Monday, lives hung in the balance.
One patient here needs at least 4 hours and almost 300 liters of water.
300
for
liters
one procedure
of water.
Of running water. For one day, we had no water at all in this unit. That's just very dangerous to their health.
For the first time since the start of the conflict, 4 of the capital's biggest hospitals were left without running water for most of a day. The Kyiv Regional Clinical Center was among the facilities impacted. Doctors and nurses here scrambled to transfer the most urgent cases.
So we must be prepared to face even the most difficult challenges.
For weeks, Moscow has pounded Ukraine's critical infrastructure, but medical facilities had so far been spared, relying on backup generators during blackouts. This week's strikes were so severe, Kyiv's water pumps stopped working, leaving some 1,500 hospital patients across the city in limbo.
This is one of the hospital's sterilization rooms. It's here that staff come to clean surgical equipment. But once the water was cut off, they could no longer do that. That means all non-emergency operations had to be canceled.
Hospitals require an enormous amount of water. This one, its officials say, uses some 15 tons per day. The medical director here says it created a huge challenge for her staff. We're ready for emergency situations every day. We can handle power cuts. But the lack of water was absolutely catastrophic for us, she tells me. We had to act quickly.
Do you worry that the water system could be cut off again by Russian missiles?
We worry every day.
You worry every day?
Every day and every morning.
For now, the city's water services are restored, but it's a matter of if, not when, Moscow will strike Kyiv's lifelines again. Selma Abdelaziz, CNN, Kyiv.